Hello and welcome to episode 40 of Off the Bandstand. My name is Christian Wiggs. I am your host. Today's episode is Russell Scanlon, a well-known guitarist and respected educator who was present in the Austin scene for decades. Russ has performed with revered jazz musicians such as Carla Bley, Steve Swallow, and David Fathead Newman. And in addition to his teaching work at Texas State University, where I first met him, and his work at Austin Community College, Russ has received recognition in Downbeat magazine and has had a robust performing career that includes numerous Broadway touring credits and orchestral stage work. So in this episode, we talk about avoiding ego and contributing to the cohesive whole on the bandstand. We also talk about the added perspective of learning the music through the lens of a different instrument and an all-out brawl that may or may not have been caused by playing jazz in a country bar. So moving on to the releases of the week, the first one that we have comes from Joan Baez's group called Times 10. This record is called Flying Blind and it came out in 2018. This is a mainstay big band that has had a long-standing residency at the Elephant Room for many years. This record came out on Fable Records, which is a local record label that has been home to many of the Austin pillars who have been holding up the scene since the 1980s, some after that, some before that even. And Flying Blind, as described on Fable Records' website, features a stylistic panorama of compositions, all from the imagination of tenor saxophone and award-winning jazz composer Dr. Joan Baez. So if you want to support this release directly and go and get a physical copy, or just go straight to the source and get a digital copy and support that, you can go over to fablerecords.biz. And then if you want to follow Dr. Joan Baez and keep up with all of his other compositions and projects, whether it is Times 10 or the multiple other things that he has been a part of and will be a part of, you can go over to Instagram at Dr. Joan Baez Music and follow him there for all the latest stuff. Then the second release of the week that we have comes from Michael Stephenson and Alexander Claffy, two incredible musicians up in the New York City scene. This track is called When a Man Loves a Woman. It's a great tune. This came out just a couple weeks back here in March of 2021. And it's the first single from a new project that is going to be called Michael Stephenson Meets the Alexander Claffy Trio. And this track features Alexander Claffy, of course, Michael Stephenson, or his stage name, Sunny Step, which you can find him on Instagram under Sunny Step, and then Julius Rodriguez, Italy Morci, and Benny Benek III, BB3, the man himself, and was recorded in the revered Rudy Van Gelder Studios in New York City. And this is going to be a joint release from Cellar Live and Law Reserve that is featuring some of the most killing musicians on the scene right now. So if you want to go and follow Michael Stephenson or Sunny Step on Instagram, you can go over on Instagram handle at Sunny Step. And then the same thing for Alexander Claffy, you can go over to at Claffy Bass to go and follow them all for the latest stuff that they have going. And then of course, all these musicians that are on this project will be tagged in that as well for easy access. So that is it for the releases of the week. Moving on to the Monk shows. The first one that we have is tonight. That's Thursday, April 15th. At 7:30, it's going to be the Mike Saylor Sextet. I'm just about to tune into this. I am so excited. It's featuring my collaborator David Mescatique on piano and has so many incredible stacked musicians on the bandstand. I believe Elias Hasslinger, saxophonist here in Austin, is going to be on it as well. Definitely tune into that live stream. And if you're watching this after the 15th of April, then you can go back. All of the concerts are kind of backlogged or cataloged, I should say, on the Monks YouTube page. So go and check it out then. The next one that we have coming up is a senior recital fulfillment for the University of Texas at Austin. It's going to be on Sunday, April 18th. It's going to be Jake Young's group, so tune into that. And then on Tuesday, the last one that we want to plug for this week, it's going to be April 20th, Tuesday at 7:30. It's the latest installment of Austin Jazz Society's Project Safety Net shows. It's going to be David Jelima's Hill Country Blue 4. So what an incredible band leader. I'm really looking forward to seeing him again. I really enjoyed his first live stream, so go and check that out. And if you can donate to Project Safety Net, the initiative that Austin Jazz Society started to take care of the most vulnerable jazz musicians financially here in the Austin city limits, then you can go over to austinjazzsociety.org and make a tax-deductible donation there, or you can just tune in to the show on Tuesday, and they will have links in the corner of the screen where you can donate, and all of the proceeds go directly to helping jazz musicians here in Austin. So anyways, that is is it for all of the plugs today. This was a really fun episode. I love talking to Russ so much. There were so many things that we got to talk about, and the time just flew by. So I hope the same experience is true for you. And please enjoy episode 40. What an incredible milestone. I always hoped that we would get this far, and I'm so glad that we are keeping on going every week. But here is episode 40, Russ Scanlon. This is Off the Bandstand. This is going to sound like maybe an intentionally vague question or elusive question, but even just based off our conversation right now and based off of our conversations like in the middle of gigs that we would play together whenever you were still in town and whenever gigs were still a thing full time, you've always struck me as somebody who is like very thoughtful and is like has things to say, but is slow to speak. And I just feel like you're a very thoughtful person in that, like, you think about things that really matter. It's not just like, oh, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? Of course, we all have those thoughts, but like, you seem like a kind of introspective person. So in your career of playing all different types of music, through what lens have you viewed like the music itself? And I know that sounds vague, but I'm just going to like throw it at you. I thought about it last night. And I was like, I'm just going to throw it at him and see what he has to say to that question.
Yeah, that is a good question. And thank you for, the comments. I appreciate that. And when you say slow to speak, I was just thinking that my wife might not agree, but that's different. I think that I'm motivated. It's like most of us in a basic way. I speak a lot about my mother, and my mother was a very social person. She loved being in groups and talking and laughing, and she was a little bit, critically, I would say she cared too much what other people thought. And I saw this as I got older with her, that it was too important, which I think sometimes for an artist is really not a good quality.
Sure.
But my motivation has been to try to play with people. And I always love being in a group and having partly the part of being part of something bigger that was greater than everybody's individual talent. That whole concept of the group sound is bigger than any one person could ever do, which is again why I found it so frustrating the last year.
Right.
Even though I've developed my solo guitar repertoire like exponentially.
Sure.
Because that's all I can really do. But I really like playing with people. And I think it goes back to just wanting to be liked and wanting to be part of some social musical group. It's fun. And I also think that, sometimes that would make me compromise things to some degree as far as my own artistic growth.
Sure.
So I always wanted to make everybody sound better and to always know when I went out to play that there was going to be a minimum level of competence. It's a funny way to put it, but that there'd be a minimum level of professionalism that we always would expect. Because, the problem for me with a lot of jazz stuff is it's always thrown together. And no matter how great people are individually, sometimes together they totally suck. And it's not fun to listen to. It's just a big ego trip. It's a big fucking ego trip. And that's a valid criticism of jazz.
Yeah.
But I like being part of a unit that's all contributing, you know, and I do appreciate that a lot, especially now, like I say. So that's my motivation. You know, I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but I had to go back as far as I could because I've had a lot of time to think about this stuff. My mom passed away 4 years ago. And of course, you go through a lot of thought about your childhood. And when my mom died, I really started thinking a lot about my father. And I think from my father, what I got was a sense of working professionalism. And I think that as a young musician, I was really lacking in that because I loved the Who and Led Zeppelin and all that stuff. And it just seemed like everybody was getting stoned and playing great. But I think when I went to music school, I realized, oh, you got to, you know, you have to be like professional and have to be responsible. And, you know, I have that part. And, you know, quite honestly, one of the reasons why I got hired at all was because I showed up on time. I didn't smell bad. And I was a decent person to hang around with. I mean, seriously. Yeah. So, you know, that stuff I needed to learn later in life. At first it was just, I just want to play and, you know, smash my guitar. And, you know, that was very powerful stuff for me.
Yeah. And whenever you said, like, I don't know if this is what you're looking for, like, you know, like I said, the point of the question was to be vague because I really just wanted to know, like, there's some people that, you know, just in conversation, not necessarily like on off the bandstand, everyone is incredibly poignant that I've had on, but there's some people that I like to ask more directed questions because I'm really interested about that. But I almost feel like, and this is going to sound like me buttering your bread, but like I don't want to be so arrogant to like think that I should pigeonhole a very specific question when it came to that, because I feel like you have so much to offer. And I know you're like shaking your head because it's like, oh, whatever. But like, seriously, man, I mean, some of the, like, just those few nights that we'd play together at Roos Chris, you know, I remember playing with, it was you and Utah. And I even texted Utah before the gig because we hadn't played together. But of course, I'd seen you all throughout my undergrad at Texas State. And I just was like, man, like that's a guy I want to have a conversation with, but I don't feel like what I would contribute to a conversation is equivalent yet to like what he would have to offer. So I wanted to like keep it more vague, but I think that is really beautiful of the fact that you did go back to childhood and that you were talking about like wanting to be social, wanting to be part of a cohesive unit. It speaks, I think, very beautifully to the idea of community and also to the idea of like a lack of an ego, which leads me into like your next point that you had talked about, where like people can all be on stage and they can be throwing down, they can be playing the most killing, like burning licks. But if they're not focused on the unit as a whole, it's going to fall apart. I think like you know, this was like a praised movie that came out that like a lot of people liked, and a lot of jazz musicians felt like they at least got it more right than other things like Whiplash or whatever, or La La Land for that matter. But the Disney movie Soul that came out, and I mean, it's a beautiful movie. It's a great movie. I really enjoyed watching it. But, you know, we were watching, and this isn't a spoiler alert, but like at the beginning of the movie, you know, he gets his audition with this, you know, crazy legendary saxophone player, and like runs down to the gig, and it's like 3 p.m. and they're doing a sound check. And then he like goes into, I can't remember what they call it in the movie, but they call it like the zone or something like that. And he's like playing, and then he finally hits his stride, and then like he goes into his whole world, and then it's like all this like beautiful like imagery, like Disney Pixar imagery, and then he like snaps out of it, and the whole band has stopped playing, and they're all just looking at him, and they're like, all right, Teach, you got the gig or whatever. But like on the bandstand, that would not fly. Like if you just went into your own thing and you were completely unaware, and like he went away from form, he went away from everything, like everybody would be like, dude, what are you doing? You're like sabotaging the gigs so you can showboat. Like that's not cool. And that's certainly not rewarded by other musicians unless it's like a unit that's been playing together for a long time, where it's understood that it's like, all right, we're all going to drop out and this person's going to like do their thing, you know, like similar to like a drum solo or whatever. But I do think that that's a very beautiful sentiment. Have you ever had the desire to be more of a frontman or band leader, or have you always been like, no, I just want to be a part of good music, whether it's a sideman or band leader?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I definitely have wanted to lead an outfit, or just as a solo thing. And sporadically I've done that. But the only band I was ever a leader of was, we played all African music. We played sukus.
Okay.
And it was a 7-piece band. It was wonderful. Probably, definitely the best. And again, going back to the social community part of it, it's probably the finest thing I ever did in my life. It was very gratifying. But I think the first thing is, I didn't start working on my singing until the last 4 or 5 years.
Okay.
And I
didn't even know you sing.
I think you have to be a singer in a lot of ways. I mean, because I'm not really interested. I'm not interested in being a guitar gunslinger. And I think that I used to maybe wish for that, because I love John McLaughlin. I love Eric Johnson. I love Glenn Rexash. And I look at those guys, I think those are guitar gunslingers. You know, Chris Duarte. There's a lot of them in Austin, and they're great. But I don't think I could, Stevie Ray Vaughan, to take it to the. But I just don't think that's as interesting to me, as maybe something that's a little broader expanse. When I was younger, when I was 25, I think I was really kind of obsessed with the idea of doing a group kind of like John Abercrombie, John Scofield, doing trios where I would play. And I did a couple of recordings years ago with some people, did that, but it just never, whether it was the thing about being the leader all the time, it might be very fundamentally that I just wouldn't want to be the center of attention constantly. Or it could be that I just, honestly, I didn't have the musical reach, and I didn't have the chops to really do that and make it interesting. But I think the main thing is the vocals, because I think in some level, Louis Armstrong was a fantastic trumpet player, and he could sing because of that. Right. And it wasn't like, oh, he's got a great voice. It was that he knew music through his instrument. And I've begun to really, I feel a little more confident about that now than I did. I'm not a great singer, but I'm trying to put myself out there as doing some vocals. Most of the stuff I'm singing is like old blues, Bob Dylan, stuff from my child. Even older than that, I actually go back to hootenanny music. And that's when I started to play guitar. So groups like the Kingston Trio, Peter, Paul, and Mary.
Got it.
And really stuff from the late 50s. I started doing a beautiful song called Last Night I Had the Strangest Dream. And I put it on Facebook, and Stanley Smith?
I know the name. I feel bad that I don't know him. Yeah.
Well, he called me and said, my book back in the late 50s. And he sold it to a lot of people.
Say that one more time. That cut out. Did you say he wrote it in the 1950s?
Stanley Smith, who was from the Midwest, he had a club, and his friend wrote that song.
Whoa.
His name was McCreary. I think it was Ed McCreary. And anyway, it was really cool, because he said, he was my friend. He wrote the tune. And Pete Seeger did it. Pete Seeger, the Kingston Trio, Joan Baez. It was very popular. I know you probably haven't heard it, but it was a popular kind of protest song. It's about peace.
Okay.
So it was nice to get that, time span. I'm really into that now. It's like, I want to feel like I did when I was 9 years old. and I've got really no distraction from that. So I've been indulging that part of myself. Like, if I remember a song from like 1961, I'll try to go back and find it, learn to play it, and sing it.
Interesting.
So
okay.
it's like exploration for me to my life.
Sure. Would you say that, because you did mention that, when your mom had passed, that there was this feeling of wanting to like go back and think about childhood and just kind of think about, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like the idea of just life and being, people are probably getting tired of me being, foo-foo or whatever, but we've been talking a lot, like with recent guests, about like mindfulness and being present in the moment. But I mean, I think that it's incredibly valid and it warrants talking about. And so I guess is that like idea of like going back to tunes from the 50s and 60s and childhood, would you say that's directly tied with just trying to be a little bit more present after your mom had passed?
Yeah, I mean, everybody starts to think about that. You have to. But the main thing is, I think I wanted to connect with why I became a musician in the first place. And one of the first songs that I ever remember hearing was, I mean, it's hard for me to say. I remember hearing musicals like My Fair Lady, Beethoven, Kingston Trio, Harry Belafonte. But there was a song that was done by the Chad Mitchell Trio called, well, it's not by them. It's Nobody Knows You When You're Down and Out. Do you know that song?
I don't. I need to look it up.
It was Bessie Smith is the original artist.
Okay.
But the first time I heard it was by the Chad Mitchell Trio. It was like a folk group. It wasn't very bluesy at all. And then I heard it the big version for Baby Boomers is by Eric Clapton on the Layla album. Okay. He does it on Layla, and that's how most people know the song. Is from Eric Clapton. But then I discovered, of course, in the course of all this, that it was actually by this Black woman from the 20s. And it's freaking amazing. When you hear that, you go, oh my God, all that other stuff, it's good. It's interesting. Right. That's the shit. Yeah. And she, of course, she is a iconic singer. So it's also like music is always that backward thing where you go back to where it is. And it's usually, for Americans, it's usually blues or jazz. Right. Almost always. And of course, show tunes, etc. So I just started to sing it as a exercise in feeling good. And now when I practice, I have to say, you're a singer, I'm not, but I think I've learned music in a completely different way by singing it. I absolutely have. It's not all those years, man. I spent years reading, studying theory, talking about theory. But when you learn a song and you learn the words and you sing it, it's a totally different part of your brain. It's not the same. That really shocked me.
I would go so far as to say it's the exact same thing with like going and sitting down at the piano and really shedding. Like I'm not, in the same way, like I'm certainly not any kind of, legitimate gigging pianist or anything like that. Like the soloing chops like aren't as much there under my fingers, but just being able to put your hands to the piano and be able to, read comp changes without hesitation, even if it's just like plopped down in front of you, and then to like add more elements that you go, oh, this is, whatever, like C7, but like, what if I add 9 and then it's like, oh, or what if I just like mess around and like add a sharp 11 to that or whatever. And I know that sounds like super basic and probably like a very inexperienced person being like, let me just like try sounds. But like the idea of being explorative and then like trying to look at what's on the page, but then realize that what's on the page is really just one person's thing that they thought sounded good. And then be like, oh, how do I want to do this as well? That is where you see like real innovation happen. So then like doing all of that to listening to people make choices and then picking up on things like just orally being like, oh, they're adding that. I like doing that as well. It totally adds a whole nother aspect to singing. And then it informs how you can do alternate melody lines. Yeah, it's a completely different thing. I have to assume too, like singing, adding the lyrical aspect, because I believe in lyrics. I think lyrics are beautiful. I think there's a lot of shitty ones out there. And like that's sometimes why they get, snubbed or whatever, especially by non-jazz people listening to jazz lyrics. They're like, oh, it's all cutesy or whatever. But then you look at like some really amazing lyrics, like the lyrics from A Cottage for Sale. Those are incredibly descriptive, like heartbreaking lyrics that like put you exactly in the right mindset of the songwriter. And it doesn't feel like they just like mad-libbed those lyrics. Anyways, I hijacked your point and went on.
No. I think that's great. I was thinking actually of Love for Sale.
Yeah.
When you know the whole story about his life and, all the irony and it's pretty amazing. The one thing that people always say, it's got to tell a story. I kind of get that. Another thing I just love is that when I'm practicing on singing, which is not that often right now, but I can, in the course of memorizing and singing, I can transport myself back to, like the other day was in 1961, I lived in Bangkok with my parents. My dad was transferred over there. Mm-hmm. And I remember this downstairs patio that we had. And I can remember sitting in that patio listening to that song. Mm-hmm. So I'm really enjoying that part of music, like the teletransporting, the feelings, like I said, I've been indulging that a lot more than thinking about technique. Mm-hmm. And I tell you what, my teacher, who's still with us, thank God, he's a beautiful person. Mm. Last time I visited him, I think he was 81 when I visited him last time, or 70. He was in the 80s. And he said, yeah, Russ, I get up every morning and I practice scales for 3 hours. I'm like, holy shit, I could not do that, Brian. Sure. I cannot do that. I think, another thing I wanted to point out is that I've discovered about myself, and you asked me earlier about wanting to be a frontman and take all the solos, and that kind of assumption, like the way a sax player might lead a band.
Sure.
And why that didn't appeal to me. And there's two things that occurred to me. One was that I think I'm always more interested in the song ultimately than the solo. Mm. As much as I love a great solo, and I appreciate it, and I hope I can play them once in a while, but the song's more interesting to me.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that no matter what kind of music I've listened to, I always end up listening to the singers. Mm. And I think it's one thing that I told you about the African band. The guitar playing in this music is so freaking cool. It's just beyond cool. It's amazing, beautiful stuff. Some of the best guitar players in the world are from the Congo and that part of Africa. But when I was in the band, I realized that the songs I really liked the best were all about the vocals. Mm. And every music I've ever listened to, I end up listening to the singers more than, with the possible exception of Coltrane and Sonny Rollins and Cannonball Adderley. It's like there's very few guys I want to hear a whole hour of just instrumental. I want to hear some singing.
Yeah.
So that might be where I've ended up.
I'm gonna take a brave leap, and I'm just gonna suggest whenever I say brave, I mean just in terms of people listening to this. I hope I don't get mad dogged in the comments. But okay, so the thing that I want to pose as a question, I'm not saying I align with this necessarily, just a thought that popped into my head is, do you think in some way that the act of singing and singers is a little bit more geared towards serving the audience, and instrumental players when playing melodies are not self-serving, but they're really focused on serving the music. Therefore, because it doesn't feel like it's packaged directly towards the listener whenever an instrumentalist is playing the melody, that maybe that can be interpreted by the audience as they're playing it for themselves and not inviting them in. Do you feel like that might play an aspect of why people feel a little bit more comfortable and attracted, like the layman feels a little bit more attracted towards singers?
Sure, absolutely. Honestly, I think there's a very small percentage of people that really just want to hear instrumental music. And that includes classical music. And we are in a bubble because of the people we hang out with.
Right.
But I think in terms of just the general population, it's probably overwhelmingly the people favor having singers in their music. And that's how they relate to music. And that's the only way they're going to relate to music.
Yeah.
A solo is something that should replace one chorus of singing, like that old school thing.
Sure.
I get that. I do. But, I'm not saying that that's all I want to do, but because I get the other side, but it's just a question of what would you really like to hitch your wagon to?
Talking about, we've kind of been talking a little bit about like lyrics and the importance of lyrics and how it just kind of like brings a different aspect to things. One of the aspects of that I wanted to mention is and I know that there's a lot of bad ones of these out there and a lot of like kind of very quickly written and just not with a lot of care. But that's why I find vocalese to be so captivating, because vocalese because you said like it's all about telling a story, right? Sometimes it can be really hard to tell a story, a full story in 32 bars in the way that you want to tell it, right? 32 bars, however long like the tune is, like a blues, right? A blues is not meant to be like a super drawn out story unless of course you're playing like Doodlin', right? The Horace Silver tune, in which case that is like 8 choruses and tells a story, but it takes a long time and there's a lot of lyrics, and then you risk mixing up the verses, but like anyways, that's why, I do think Thomas Winglinski challenged me in the sense of like, there were some vocalies that I was really excited to show him. And he was like, I don't know if like this needs lyrics, because like, it's just like cramming stuff in for the sake of cramming stuff in. And initially I was like the biggest proponent of it. And I'd be like, no, all vocalese is valid. And then I kind of like understood what he was saying, that I was like, oh, if it doesn't translate, or if it's just too much of a thing where the listener's having to like really grasp on to understand what you're saying, then yeah, maybe that's not the solo to transcribe and apply lyrics to. But there are some, like, to go back to Kurt Elling's like 2007 Night Moves record, the last tune on that record is I Like the Sunrise, Duke Ellington tune, that then he puts vocalese to a Von Freeman solo,
nice.
legend Von Freeman. And the playing of Von Freeman already adds as much beauty as you need, but the lyrics that Kurt writes to it is just, it breathtaking, and it just feels like this full arrival. And the idea of a melody that is through composed in the way that like a solo generally is. Maybe they'll call back a lick here and there, a chorus later or whatever, but the idea of something that's through composed that then you can attach lyrics onto, it feels very linear, like a story should be, how a storyteller should tell, as opposed to like, oh, here's this A section and it needs to have an A-B rhyme scheme or whatever. You're not limited by those conventions when you're applying it to something that is just it's straight going somewhere and it's not looking backwards. So I don't know.
Yes,
for what it's worth.
I totally understand that. Actually, that's really a nice point. And when you think about music, why do we even have any of these rules? It's really odd how we decided on 8-bar verses, and I'm kind of stuck with that because that's what I grew, even with rock,
Sure.
Until you got to James Brown, where things were not so much done in, sections, 8-bar sections. And I think James Brown really is kind of an example of what you're talking about, because, it's a riff and he goes, and I'm sure he repeated himself. I know he did, but that was kind of through compose too.
Yeah.
Like Papa Don't Take No Mess, or that stuff. So yeah, why do we need to have these artificial sections? I mean, I suppose that just goes back to poetry, and if you're tied to that traditional poetry form in the English language, but really not just English, all of those languages.
Yeah.
So
But
I think that's a valid point.
Even that, I think that, like, we talk about like conventional poetry standards or rules that abide by that. I feel like the cultural, and I am by no means an authority or have looked into this enough to be able to like speak definitively on this, but like kind of as you were saying, like when you were coming up into like early adulthood, there was this very kind of like screw convention, like the whole thing of the adults thing, right? Like maybe they don't know exactly what's best, let's challenge everything and let's figure things out for ourselves, which I think in and of itself is like a renaissance, because it's like, because we are very much taught of like, we're going to grow up, and when things are easily digestible and we can like learn and memorize a bunch of things, we're taught that at such a early age. And so to challenge everything then after you've like already had all that prerequisite knowledge of everything that like this is going to sound super like hippie of me, but like the established order or whatever like wants you to learn, then you're like, well, why are we doing this? Let's really explore this, because if we don't explore the inverse of what we were taught, how do we know that we really agree with the original thing that we were taught? So all of that to say, to bring that back, I think that culturally there was a big shift in all different forms of art and medium, where like the beat poets, right? Like that was not necessarily like a rhyme scheme, thing. And it was very raw, and it was very like just expressive, maybe self-servingly, maybe not necessarily for the listener exactly. But I think that that then translates even into certain iterations of jazz, not just kind of like the protest song movement and stuff like that, but like different sections of jazz where it was like, yeah, we're just going to do a bunch of stuff that's more like avant-garde. Yeah, I'm kind of going on a tangent at this point, but
well, not really. I was going to say about the boomers. I'm increasingly, what you said was true about challenging the establishment. Hope I die before I get old. What a brilliant line, man.
Yeah.
And now he's old.
Yeah.
And he's had to reconcile that his entire life.
Yeah, right.
Which he's done beautifully. He's evolved. He's become something else,
Yeah.
But the other thing I was just going to say is that sometimes when I look at that time, of which I feel really, no matter what else happens in my life, I think I was supremely blessed. I don't use that word a lot, but I was blessed to have been born in that bubble. Because first of all, it was probably, this is going out on a limb, it was probably the single most prosperous time in humanity, in the history of humanity, where more people became elevated economically and socially. I believe that. But also when you look at it, it's just biological. It's like pure statistics. There were just so freaking many of us.
Yeah.
We were overwhelming. We overwhelmed the schools. We overwhelmed the colleges. We overwhelmed the music business. And finally, the music business couldn't say no anymore. They tried.
Right.
CBS didn't even have a rock and roll act until I think the Byrds were the first band that they ever signed in 1966, 65.
Wow.
They resisted. They were not going to put out rock and roll records, And then, of course, when they decided to, they went out and signed to everybody and spent a shitload of money.
Sure.
But there was that resistance to youth culture. But in the long run, they had to bow down because there were just so many of us.
Yeah.
So when you look at it that way, it's like just a biological, if you look at human history, it's like just a bubble of the population. So whatever we think is obviously going to have an influence for a long time.
Sure.
Well, I think that's faded quite a bit. Now, like, of course, when you say baby boomer now, a lot of people your age just want to kill us and get, because we are kind of a burden. We're a burden on the system at a certain level with all the Great Society stuff and New Deal stuff. We are to some degree. I think that's simplified. That's probably a more complicated issue than we can sort out. But I know that, to get back to it, I feel tremendously fortunate. I would not want to be in my 20s now. I think that the problems in the world are much more significant and more serious. And, when I was about 5 years old, the book Silent Spring came out. And that was the first book that looked at the biological fact of Earth and said, this ain't going to keep working.
Yeah.
It's just not going to keep working. And we were warned here's the thing you can slam the boomers for. We were warned about that almost 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And we didn't do shit about it. And, because expediency and money and all those things, it's like, we know what the right answer is. I am almost daily engaged in discussions online with this oil company guy. And he's a nice guy. He's a good guy. But his point of view of the world is entirely, we need to keep extracting. We need, no matter what, we got to keep this thing going because I survive on it. It's my survival. Therefore, that's the most important thing, is that I survive.
Sure.
And, forget Standing Rock or the oil spills or all the other horrible stuff, which we know is true if we're honest.
Yeah.
But, it's just, people have self-interest. And, I'm not really condemning this guy either. I want to say he's a nice person. Yeah. He's smart. We could go out for a beer. I hope America is always like that.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, I don't know how he feels all the time, but as far as I'm concerned, it'd be fine. But what I'm saying is that, you can really point your finger at the boomers for a lot of stuff. And maybe that's one thing.
Sure. Well, I think there's a certain element that is not exclusive to boomers. It's kind of just like human nature in general. Like if you have a paper that you have to write in school, speaking about my generation now, if you have a paper that you write in school and you know that it's due on April 30th and it's April 14th, in my mind right now, I'm like, oh, I've got tons of time to write that paper. And then April 28th is going to come around and I'm going to go, oh, shit, and now I'm going to like make a entire pot of coffee, and I'm going to pull an all-nighter and just hope that the things that I write are coherent. I think human nature is not overwhelmingly not proactive. So if there's like a warning about something, people don't generally feel like they need to act until, the house party is that night and your house is a wreck, and then the panic sets in. It doesn't justify the behavior, but I think it is understandable. And it's kind of just something that kind of transcends age group. Now we're seeing an entire generation maybe be a little bit more vocal about that and a little bit more proactive, but it's really just because we're like, oh, the science says that we have to act now. And I think that kind of, I feel like there's a mentality, like specifically talking on the climate thing, where it's like, oh, well, we have all this time because we've been hearing about it for so long. Like I have grandparents, without singling out one of them, who say like, oh, but they've been talking about that forever. They've been talking about climate change forever. And I'm like, well, yeah, they have, and we haven't done anything about it. But so of course they're still talking about it, like, and it's getting worse. Like it's not getting better. So I think just there's this mentality of like when something's introduced, it's like, oh, but we still have time. But then there's this other group that's like shown the reality of the situation in a very kind of sobering way. And I don't think you can fault, well, I say that, and then as soon as I'm off the record, I'm going to be, drinking whiskey and be like, let's fault all these people. But I don't think we can necessarily like fault people as much for not being as informed when they're not in a stage of life that allows them to be informed all the time. I have this conversation with Lydia a lot, who's been my partner for the past 5.5 years. And I'm always like, no, it's their responsibility to be engaged, to be educated, to be yada, yada, to be a yada, yada. And something that even my parents have said is like, we don't have time to be like looking at all these news stories. And I get it, like, because they have mortgages, they had kids to raise, they had bills, they had all these different things. Yes. And I kind of, in a cushy way, being a full-time musician, you know, COVID excluding, I have time to look at those kind of things. Now, does that excuse them from being educated? No, I don't think so. But is it understandable that they have less facility to do that because of the other obligations they have in their life? Yes. And I should probably extend more grace to them for that.
There's a difference between uninformed and deliberately sabotaging reality and science.
Yeah.
That's a big step, which is what we've seen since the 70s. But again, you know, I don't know. I get mailers constantly. I can't even use my email anymore because I've given money to certain causes and then I'm just bombarded. Yeah. And you get exhausted. Yeah. But I think everybody really knows what's right and wrong. Well, we can get back to music anytime, but I you know, it only tied into my mind. It only tied into my mind as much as, you know, we're talking about music from my youth and how a lot of it was protest, social. And I was going to add that, you know, when I was learning to play, choosing to become a musician was really kind of a social act. It was like an act of political definition.
Sure.
And it was intertwined completely. And that changed. You know, that kind of stopped after the 70s, I think. But, you know, it was like, I kind of come from that time where musician and activists kind of were together. The peace movement, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, all through that time. I mean, there's definitely musicians that were not doing that kind of thing. But as far as what was really happening, you know, in 1969, I went to see The Who and Led Zeppelin. Now, I very easily in 1969, had I been a different kind of person, I mean, I could have gone to see, I don't know who to think about, Sonny and Cher, or I think of some bullshit band, you know. Yeah. But no, that wasn't what was happening. What was happening was The Who and Led Zeppelin. That what was happening. The other stuff was just not happening. It was obsolete. Pat Boone. Have you seen the Pat Boone video, by the way?
No.
He's singing "Smoke on the Water." It's on Facebook. You must check it out. Okay. But you know, what I'm saying is that, you know, if you were young and you were involved at all, music was a big part of it.
In the same way that I feel like, you know, your generation in that like coming of age thing started to band together and like demanded change. I think the same thing is happening. I mean, you're seeing traditionally red states that are turning purple and in cases entirely blue. And so I think there is sort of like a generational social uprising that we are like just on the cusp of, that we've been seeing like really start to come to a head in the past 5 years. And we will see in the next 5 years really start to like turn the whole thing on its head. Hopefully.
I hope so. I hope so. Particularly with regard to race, climate change, you know, because it's more of a present thing for you guys. Right. I think what we really need right now are some anthems from young musicians in their 20s, some rallying cries. You know, The Times They Are Changing was remarkably galvanizing song. And it spoke. So that's what music can do. And people's attitudes change incrementally, but a song like that really was powerfully effective. And, you know, I'm not a Dylan freak necessarily, but that all those, you know, like getting back to that kind of music I was talking about, it was galvanizing. People rallied behind it. And whether it was overtly political or it was just like fashion, like the Beatles and stuff, and sonic improvements, there was a sense of like, you got to take a side.
Yeah,
you know,
right.
you have to get on one side or the other. There's no more, don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the halls. It's like, get out of the way if you're not going to be part of the solution. It's a very 60-ish thing, you know, but that song was remarkably powerful. So we need some of that now for the Greta Thunbergs, and, you know, like something that we shall overcome as a civil rights anthem.
Mm-hmm.
We need some anthems, God damn it.
that's the clip of the show. Like, that's the trailer. Some anthems.
Y'all got to write them though. It's got to be. It has to be. It has to be coming from that side, you know. And you know, I think a lot of rap is very political. But I don't know, everybody's into their little specialized audience now. It's just not the same. I mean, you know, 3 networks, 4 major record companies. It's a lot different. You know, when the Beatles albums came out, everybody bought them. Yeah, everybody. Right. It wasn't like, oh well, this is the, you know, pop rock section of the record store. Yeah. You bought them in Sears. You bought them in Woolworths. It was really pretty remarkable.
Trying to say people didn't just listen to 30 seconds of a track on Spotify back then? Is that what you said?
It's like it was a commitment all the way around.
Yeah.
And I think people's attention spans are, and mine included, you know, become very short.
It is hard to maintain that focus and to really give that attention when there is a lot of stimulation around. But I think we're still capable. Certainly. I think it's just a matter of dialing it back in.
Yes.
Speaking of,
absolutely.
Do you have records that you would, like, specific records that you would say, like, as soon as this is over, like, everyone go listen to this record, boom, check that out initially, or not initially, immediately?
Well, you mean in line with the political thing or just in general?
Anything.
You know, I've been wanting to talk to somebody about this, but honestly, I just haven't been listening to music in a long time.
Okay.
I mean, I listen to things functionally, and on a normal week around this house, there's no music playing. All I can tell you is that I spent so much of my life listening to stuff. As a teacher, as a person trying to get into clubs, working. And I feel like I'm not up to snuff, certainly on modern jazz players or guitarists or whatever. When I do listen to music, I listen to African music because it makes me feel good.
Very cool.
And I don't like to listen to old stuff. I wouldn't leave and put on a Bob Dylan album from the 60s either, because I've heard that so many times. I mean, it's just like,
sure.
Occasionally I'll get like, it's like craving a spice, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't. I'm really enjoying the quietness, and then when I play, I feel like I'm completely free of trying to copy people. So, you know, I've been doing a lot of these little arrangements. I stick them up on Facebook, and they generally just come from me thinking about a tune and then trying to reconstruct it. I don't want to use music. I don't want to write anything down. I want to just construct it from memory. I just did one yesterday for Jitterbug Waltz.
Okay.
Which is really a tough song, man. It's a weird little song. But I just didn't want any influences. I mean, I can't, it's really kind of weird. But I do remember years ago, I saw Gary Burton talking at North Texas when I was an undergrad. And somebody asked him the same question. He's like, what are you listening to? And he said, you know what? When I get off tour, I go out to the country and I don't listen to anything. And at the time, I remember thinking, oh man, that's weird.
Yeah.
You know, like,
yeah,
how can you not listen to any music? But I get it now. I really do. It's like saturation. I think I'll probably go back to more listening, but I'm in a cycle now where I'm really just I'm not putting anything on. I listen to a lot of African guitarists and African music. Some Brazilian music. I got a craving for Coltrane the other day, so I put on one of my favorite of his albums, Crescent,
Yep.
with the quartet. That whole era of his, I just love the Impulse stuff. I love just everything he did in that little bubble time. But if I'm trying to learn a tune, I'll just go and listen to 4 or 5 versions of the song to get some ideas. But it's not like I'm trying to not be. I'm trying to just really hone in on what I have to say and not be distracted too much. I want to be accurate, but I don't want to be just trying to sound like someone else, because I've done that a lot.
That's incredibly poignant. I don't want to be, wow, it just escaped my mind. It was a word starting with an A, but you said, I don't want to be distracted. I want to be like informed, to use like a synonym, but or accurate. That's what you said. I want to be accurate, but I don't want to be distracted. If only we all had that mentality of making music.
It's very hard.
Of
and,
course it is.
I was a teacher for a long time, but I tell you, the best advice that I ever heard or gave as a teacher was to say, find your own sound. If you can do that early in your life, it's golden. If you figure out what you want to do. I always admired Stevie Ray Vaughan and people like that. He knew what he wanted, man. He was going for something very specific. Hendrix, you could certainly say that about a lot of horn players. Not all of them, but it seems like some of them, they really found their thing early. Certainly Dizzy, people like that.
Yeah.
And it was unique. Like, you hear them and you know immediately who they are. But with guitar, I think it's kind of tough.
Yeah.
I really do, because we all have access to the same gear. And when something becomes popular, like when Pat Metheny started using chorus, everybody starts using chorus. When John Scofield's playing with a certain dirty sound, everybody starts to do it. So I want to avoid that, definitely.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And the other thing was to make your instrument sound like a voice. That's probably, those two things seem to be truth to me. And I'm not just talking about being popular, because it's more like just, if you're going to really communicate, you have to have a recognizable voice. And people go, oh, so-and-so's talking. Not just some guy on saxophone or some guy playing blues licks.
Right.
But, somebody's talking. And the other thing is that the listener can hear a sound that sounds like this. Like how pianists do that, I will never understand.
Yeah.
I will never get that. But they do. They do.
Yeah.
It.
Yeah.
Guitar is the same. I think it's easy in some ways to mimic things, but guitar gets into a really battle with amplification and with processing. And it's not always bad, but it kind of makes everybody sound the same.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really brilliant and beautiful piece of advice, and a very beautiful way of like kind of bringing that, like that whole conversation that we had, like full circle of where we were talking about lyrics and communicating and having like a voice. And one thing that I didn't say earlier, but I had thought about, and then just it went out of my mind and I didn't say it, but it's just like the whole thing of like, singers are trying to sound like instrumentalists and instrumentalists are trying to sound like singers, and not in the way that we're like necessarily trying to like sound exactly. When I'm singing, I'm not trying to sound like a trumpet, like the like essences of a trumpet. I'm trying to pick up the style and the intentionality. And I think that the opposite, or not the opposite, but the inverse of that is absolutely true for instrumentalists trying to sound like singers, is just like being able to make your instrument a vehicle of expression that feels accessible and meaningful to a listener.
Technique is an interesting thing. I spent at least 35 to 40 years of my life obsessing about technique. And I have a pretty good mathematical mind. So I'm not negating the fact that you have to learn about scales and chords.
Yeah.
But frequently, that's the end of the discussion. And the part that is really, and I can think of several students I have, you probably know some of these guys where I thought they have something going on, man. It's like, it's just the way their fingers are hitting strings. It's not anything, it's a really personal, physical thing. I don't want to mention names because they might get embarrassed, but there's one or two guys that came into play. They didn't know much at all, but man, the guitar just sounded beautiful. It was beautiful. It's like, it was just, you just go, this person can play the guitar. It doesn't matter what I teach him. And two of the proudest moments of my life as a teacher was when I encouraged, there's two specific guys, and I told them to quit school. I said, you don't need this. Just go out and do your thing. I was cutting my own salary to a certain degree. I wasn't promoting my studio. But I said, you don't need this. You need to go out and start playing. And in both cases, that was the right thing to tell them. And I wouldn't say that to 99% of the students I had. Yeah. So, dude, you need to work on your fucking scales, man. You need to learn to tune your fucking guitar. But these guys, it was just like, man, I was in awe. And, in a different way, and I can mention his name because I really do admire him, Cat.
That's exactly who I thought of. Yep.
And Cat was, Cat wasn't one of those two, but, it was like, dude, you've got nothing to worry about.
Yeah.
Only thing is just how to conduct yourself. And he's just a beautiful guy, man. Yeah. But he had that sound at the very beginning. You go, yeah, that's it, man.
Yeah.
There's nothing I can teach you except just how to get through college, And I heard we were back in Austin a couple of weeks ago. I got to hear him play. It was nice. He played a driveway concert. But he just have, some people are born with a certain specific thing about their instrument. Maybe it's the lip or the hand size or, whatever it is. But he's definitely got that.
Yeah.
And in a very different way. And I'll mention his name too. It's oh geez, I'm blanking. I love him. Art Carvalho.
Yeah.
Where you just go, geez, man. And I had those two guys at the same time.
Whoa, yeah.
And I think I told you this in our last conversation, but after that, I was like, I can't do any better than this, no matter where I go. Having two guys like that in your class at the same time, really different kind of players, way, way advanced, as young people. So, that's nice when that happens. But honestly, there were a lot of people who I would go, maybe the first encounter is not so great, but you always have to give people a chance.
Yeah.
And sometimes when you do, it's incredibly rewarding. I mean, it's like you're just amazed. You hear them 5 years later, you're just amazed. It's very gratifying. I learned as a teacher, be kind, listen to people, and don't write anybody off.
Man.
Just don't. You can't do it. I was wrong a lot, about people. My first impression would be, and I'd be wrong. Yeah. So, but to get back to the thing about finding your voice, I think for me, it was a really 30 plus year process.
Yeah.
And for people who are luckier in a certain way, they find that on early in their life.
That's really beautiful. That's really, really beautiful, man. Russ, I always feel, I know I started the conversation with this, and I'm saying this again now, but I always feel so much more enlightened. And I just feel like it's like, man, I can't think of anything that I would have rather done for the past hour and 45 minutes other than just talking to you, man. Like it makes me so happy just having meaningful conversation that can be lighthearted, can be fun, but at the same time, it's like talking about things that matter and, kind of going deep and not worrying about like, oh, are we being too deep? No, it's just like, let's talk about these questions. Like nothing's off limits. I feel like it's just like, It's a
Oh,
perfectly
good.
balanced meal. It's like getting a plate at dinner that's got your vegetables, it's got your carbs, it's got your protein, you know, and then you got a nice whatever for dessert. And speaking of a dessert, or maybe just like a spicy dessert, I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked for the kind of holiday special, which is, do you have any gigs from hell that specifically stand out? In addition, of course, to the Cats in the Cradle marathon story, do you have any other gigs from hell that you can think really stand out?
Yes.
Hit me.
Okay. Almost anything with John Blundell, who, by the way,
Lovingly.
absolutely, he
Yeah.
is a mentor. He's really a mentor for me, which is scary to say. I think a lot of my ethics about just musical ethics, not personal.
Sure.
They come from playing with him.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's always an adventure. You know, when I started to play really kind of professionally, I was finishing up school in North Texas.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had a breakup with a girl or something. I was feeling really down, you know, and this guy called me out of the blue and says, Russ, would you like to play in our country band? And I thought, well, of course I'd do that. Anybody can do that. And of course I was totally wrong. But we played gigs in Oklahoma where there actually was chicken wire. And I thought that was just a myth.
Yeah.
No, there was chicken wire all at the front. And
whoa,
our band wasn't really great, but we, you know, by that point I'd kind of gotten into what I was doing, and they didn't throw anything at us. And then I played a gig with a guy who was a songwriter at the time. I think his name was Nat Stuckey. He wrote a couple of hits. And we were playing in a rodeo in a small town in North Texas. And they put us above the bullpen with our amps and drums.
Mm.
And they said, well, when Nat comes up to play, they want him to ride around in the arena so they can see him, because we were kind of hidden.
Sure.
And so this fella had he had bought 100-foot plus guitar cord, because this is before remotes. He plugged it into my amplifier over the bullpen and they drove around, and he played. Of course, he turned up really loud. I had an amp with 2 channels. He plugged into one of the channels, and, you know, I had to crank it. That was just surreal, you know.
Yeah.
And it smelled really bad, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, I have to assume you're right above the bullpen.
Really, really bad. And then, you know, all those gigs were really rough. They were kind of rough and tumble. There were a lot of oil workers up there. And the last thing I'll tell you, in the same time frame, we played up in Gainesville, Texas. We at this point, I was playing with a group that did kind of jazzy pop music. And we played at this really rough place. And there were a bunch of oil workers in there, and everything was getting really rowdy. And I am convinced that the energy from our music made them hostile.
Okay.
Not because we were bad, because they were used to hearing Hank Williams.
Sure.
So there was an edge in the place. You could just feel it. And I guess in our first set, all of a sudden, a guy comes flying across the bandstand. He'd been sucker punched, smashes into the drums.
Oh my God. I
grab my Les Paul, and I'm holding it like this, and everybody gets off the bandstand.
Yeah.
And there's a fight in this place. Christian, I can't describe to you. Everybody in the place was fighting. Everybody. It was like a Western.
Yeah.
And there was a guy that somebody was holding him on the ground. They were kicking him in his face.
Whoa.
It was scary, crazy. So we go off to this little patio area, and nobody bothers us. Nobody's trying to, you know, we sort of just went off and kind of crouched. And the whole place is just, everybody's just pounding each other. And then, and we're like, oh my God, you know, this is unbelievable. The cops came. This is the funny part. The cops came. They cleared the room. They took several guys to jail. Everybody's bloody. The bartender's bloody. And we played our second set.
Oh my
It was
God.
like nothing. It was like nothing had ever happened. Nothing had ever happened.
Were you playing to an empty room, or was it like a new wave of customers?
There was a much more quiet second wave of people.
Oh.
And we made it through the evening. I know we made it through the evening and got our $20 a piece, whatever it was.
Oh my
But
God.
that was, I mean, those places were tough up there. They were really, and I don't think I had any idea how bad it was. Those are a cluster of kind of country music. Everybody that's played country music up there has stories like that.
Yeah. Wow.
Especially from the set. This was in the mid 70s. And so it was pretty, it was a pretty tough part of the country. I don't know if you spent much time up in Denton or been to Denton at all, I don't know. But in the 70s, it was pretty rural around there. And so if you wanted to work, you had to play country music,
Yeah. That's one way to cut your teeth, man. That's
I learned a lot. And I have appreciation. And actually, I started to sing a couple of tunes as this sort of exercise in nostalgia. And they're beautiful. I love them. I don't play them traditionally, but I think Hank Williams was truly a poet,
Yeah.
And I do one by him and one by Merle Haggard. And I know it's the only reason I would do something like that is because of that time, when I was playing about 4 or 5 years. So, yeah, I think when we put ourselves in danger, maybe that should be a cutoff point.
A red flag. Yeah,
right.
Sure.
But there's been, that's one time I realized that was a time when I thought our music was making people kind of hostile because we were doing like bossa novas, this crowd of oil workers. And we just didn't know any better. So we were doing like bossa novas and kind of like, we were doing stuff like Michael Franks, Michael Franks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Real smooth jazz kind of shit. And I think it was just making them really upset. Like it was like that theme from Talladega Nights with Charlie Parker in the jukebox. And
yeah, right.
I think everybody that's ever played music understands that scene.
Yeah.
But a lot of people I know saw that movie, they go, I don't get it. I said, well, you have to be a musician, man. It's funny.
Yeah. Oh man, that's funny. That's so good. Well, hopefully your gigs in Santa Fe when gigs come back are spared from the hostility of playing bossa novas.
I don't know. It's pretty rough and tumble up here, man. It really is. It's a lot more of a frontier place. There's a great guitarist up here named Pat Malone who told me that up until the late 70s, there was a place down south of town where people would ride in on horseback and hitch their horses. Man. And they had bands, they had country bands and dance bands and stuff. So it's really interesting up here. I do like it. I've been feeling a little bit isolated, but that's probably going to change. It's just it's a very fascinating. This is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the United States.
Wow.
It was founded in 1598. So there's little places down the road where the original structures were built in the 1700s. And that's, in America, that's kind of a rare thing.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of really interesting history here, which we're kind of getting into.
Yeah. Well, man,
I don't know about the gigs.
Yeah, sure. But, well, Russ, man, thank you again for coming on and doing this. And I'll see you, I don't know, in the next month and a half or so.
Right. Thanks.
Cool, man. All right. Peace.